Today, we're going to cover vaccine hesitancy, and we're really delighted to have Rebecca Dielschneider with us. And I'm very pleased to welcome you here, Rebecca.
Thanks for the welcome, Randy. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, that's great. I see you're at Providence University College in Manitoba. Does that mean that you're Canadian by birth and raised up in Manitoba?
I am Canadian. I was not born in Manitoba. I was born and raised on the East Coast in Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia, that's great.
Beautiful province. Yep.
Uh-huh. Okay. And so where did you get your education?
So I received some of my education in Nova Scotia, where I was born. So I attended Dalhousie University and earned my Bachelor of Science with co-op and honors there. And it was a co-op job that actually brought me out to Winnipeg, Manitoba. So that was my first exposure to the land of mosquitoes and the land of weather extremes. And I surprisingly made a lot of good connections here and therefore decided to pursue my graduate studies here. So my Ph.D.
That's great.
is in the field of immunology and cancer biology, and that's from the University of Manitoba.
That's fantastic. Immunology and cancer is really a big deal these days. So how'd you get interested in biology in the first place? What influenced you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose I've always been interested in science. I don't know if I can pinpoint a time when I knew I would become a scientist. When I was really young, I thought I would do science experiments in space. And then I realized that maybe I want to just stay down on Earth and do them down here. So it was probably in high school when I decided that biology was my area of expertise.
That's great.
I distinctly remember an individual from public health coming to our high school biology class and talking about the annual flu vaccine. And that got me hooked. The rest is history, I suppose.
That's a great story. So tell us a little bit about the Providence University College. I'm sure not everyone is going to be familiar with that.
Sure. So Providence is located in rural Manitoba, technically in Otterburne, Manitoba, about half an hour south of Winnipeg, if you're familiar with Manitoba. We're a fairly small Christian institution, so Providence is really kind of divided into two parts, the University College, where I'm employed, and the Theological Seminary, where some others actually in this call are employed. Hi, Robert.
That's great.
And I've been there for the past 5 years. Providence actually just started a science program with me, so I was their first full-time hire. So I had really the joy to unleash some creativity and build a science program from the ground up. When I was interviewed, the science labs were actually under construction still, so it was a very exciting phase.
Yeah, that's great. Now, if I understand it right, this is the Providence where Patrick Franklin was?
It is, yes. As you heard previously, he was part of the committee that hired me, so we know each other.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and I think many of you on this call will remember him as a book review editor and who's recovered from his health issues in the last year and a half. It's really a great story. So how did it happen that you came to write an article here for PSCF?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had read several issues of the journal over the years, and I've really enjoyed the publication, the journal overall. And I suppose it probably began in 2019 when I gave a short talk on vaccines and scientific literacy and trying to address vaccine hesitancy a little bit. Providence has these wonderful talks every fall that we call Prov Talks, where profs at Prov give public talks, sort of in the TED style. And they're really enjoyable. I do one every year, and I have a blast. And so my 2019 talk was all about vaccine hesitancy, and I explored it so much at the time, and I've explored it so much in my studies that I thought perhaps I should write an article about this because so many people came up to me afterwards. So many people said that they sent the YouTube link of my talk to their friends and family, and they had more questions. And so I thought perhaps an article was a great way to dive a little bit deeper into the issue.
And that was all before COVID-19.
That was all far before COVID-19. Yep.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. So I see your article is more general in vaccines, but in time you're able to add specific comments about COVID-19, and I'm sure our discussion today will pursue that direction as well. So let's get into that topic a little bit. So I'll be a skeptic here for a little while. So really, why should I trust getting a vaccine? I mean, it from its very start, it does seem a little scary that you're taking part of the virus itself and injecting it in people, or that's the way it used to be done, I suppose. And it seems a little dangerous. So how can we be sure that these vaccines are really safe?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, Randy. And I obviously tried to address that in my article a little bit. And I acknowledge that vaccines, really any pharmaceutical, any medicine, maybe can seem scary to some people, especially people outside of science, outside of medicine, because it seems a bit mysterious. Maybe they don't understand the manufacturing process. Maybe they don't understand the research. Maybe they don't understand the ingredients. And it's interesting that you use that verb trust, because that does come in quite a bit. Some people that are vaccine hesitant are because they just don't trust scientists and doctors. They don't trust pharmaceutical companies. But others just genuinely have questions because they just don't understand some of the process along the way. And so hopefully in my article, you were able to see some of my explanations about the ingredients of the vaccines, a bit of the process for manufacturing and approving vaccines. Vaccines do go through fairly rigorous testing. And anyone that studies clinical trials, like I have over the years, I'm actually teaching a pharmacology course this summer where we explore clinical trials and pharmaceuticals in depth. And anyone who's familiar with that process knows the rate of failure. A lot of drugs, a lot of pharmaceuticals aren't approved that enter that clinical trial pipeline. And so I think knowing a bit of the science behind the process of approval and also knowing the high failure rate can perhaps give you a little bit of confidence that what comes out and what is approved at the end of the day is the best of the best.
Although if there's a high failure rate at the beginning, it also may mean that some will squeak through and some vaccines are going to get through and they aren't going to be so safe, right?
Well, I suppose there is always the little chance, but these clinical trials involve so many people, so many researchers, so many medical physicians and professionals. Health Canada involves so many experts that will then vet these before they give their final approval. And so I think the chance of all of those people missing something along the way is perhaps minuscule.
Well, that may be, but especially thinking of COVID-19, these vaccines have apparently been done with reckless speed. I mean, when all previous vaccines that you're talking about that are so safe have taken years to develop, now suddenly, less than a year, we're supposed to have it out. We're supposed to trust that more. That doesn't seem reasonable, does it?
That's a great point, Randy. And that's a point that many others have made over this past year. I'm sure many in the audience perhaps have felt that or have seen that shared in the media or by their friends and family. And I think it's a reasonable feeling, first and foremost, to just be nervous, perhaps at the speed in which these approvals came. But on one hand, it's very encouraging to see the progress that has been made in the vaccine industry over years. We are sequencing genomes faster than we ever could before. And so it really makes sense scientifically that we are making vaccines faster than we ever have before, because our scientific process, our methods, our tools, our techniques are improving year after year. And especially in a pandemic, like I argued in my article, everyone now has a shared focus. We've declared war on a common enemy, and a lot of the usual hurdles and paperwork and timelines that draw these processes out have been eliminated.
But nevertheless, if you don't have as much time, are you really able to determine what's happening? For example, I've heard a lot about autism happening after vaccines, and has there been enough time to find out whether these vaccines are going to have that problem?
So I suppose in one way there has not been, so far the clinical trials, I suppose, have not found any neurological defects in vaccine recipients. I think we can be confident that they won't, because other vaccine trials have shown that there is no association between the development of autism and vaccinations. So many studies after studies after studies, really long-term studies, especially by Madsen's group out of the Europe area, they have looked at decades of their vaccination records, which are really quite detailed, and have found absolutely no association. And I must admit, the misinformation that persists about autism and vaccinations is baffling to me at times. The fact that this misinformation has persisted all of this time since the early work of Andrew Wakefield and others, it's just a testament, I suppose, to how fast a lie can travel compared to the truth, unfortunately.
Yeah. But what about blood clots like the AstraZeneca? I mean, everybody denied it. No, we got a lot of data. Now suddenly, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Why doesn't this destroy some trust?
I think the fact that Europe and other countries have paused and really tried to assess this and put committees on this task can maybe create confidence, perhaps generate trust in the public. I'm very encouraged by the fact that a lot of countries did pause and ask the question, okay, we have seen a couple of these cases, especially out of the UK, that had administered the most doses of AstraZeneca Oxford COVID-19 vaccine. And so when they started to notice a few abnormalities, I am very comforted by the fact that they paused, that they stopped to reassess, and that they have changed some of their guidelines coming out of that assessment. And
all right. So you're saying that the fact that they kind of caught it before it really got very far is a good sign.
There's always a risk with pharmaceuticals, and thankfully, in my opinion, these risks were caught quite early. And now that we've revised guidelines, I'm confident that fewer of these cases will occur. And the more that we study this abnormal clotting event, the more hopefully we can be able to catch it really early in the patients that do develop it and treat it before anything adverse occurs.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Let me just, before opening it up to discussion and everyone, let me ask a little bit more on a theological aspect. And this may be particularly true when we think of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines and their RNA base. I mean, didn't God create us specifically, and the DNA and the RNA that we have, they define who we are, and this is how God has created us. So why are we messing with what God created? This injecting RNA in us, and who knows? Maybe it's going to modify some genes in us and do some things. Aren't we playing around with interfering with God's will in our lives? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that is such a significant topic. And before I dive into it, perhaps I should admit to everyone that I am not a theologian. I am a scientist. I read the Bible and I go to church and I learn a lot from my theological colleagues. And I will answer this question as well as I can, but acknowledge and understand that I am not a theologian. So yeah, where to start? I think first and foremost, I'll address the DNA modification aspect of your comments and your questions. And so
yeah, the scientific aspect.
Maybe, I'll start off with that. That's easier to address. In the age of CRISPR and Cas9, indeed, we can modify genomes. And that's a completely separate topic and a separate discussion for another day. But I understand why people think that perhaps a vaccine could do something like that, because other scientific technologies can. But when you look at the components of this vaccine, there is no DNA in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And even the RNA that is present is not in a form and cannot be manipulated in such a way that it would ever insert into our genome.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can be confident that we are not manipulating our genetic material if and when we receive vaccines like these.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an interesting thought about, or your questions about, okay, if we're born with the DNA and the RNA that we have, why should we take more, perhaps? But every time we are infected with a virus, we are exposing our body and the cells within it to their genetic material. I mean, our gut is full of foreign genetic material. Our skin, a lot of our body is colonized with these other organisms. And so it is quite a natural process that we are exposed to bacteria and protists and viruses of all sorts. And if we expose our bodies to just very specific parts, maybe just a little bit of that viral RNA or a little bit of that bacterial toxin or a little bit of all of these organisms, then we can teach our immune system to recognize them without actually getting sick. And so maybe to just add on to that, if I can, some people will say that vaccines are just very synthetic and they would much rather acquire immunity in a natural process with a natural infection, the natural virus. But vaccines, even though we synthesize them in a lab, are really influenced, inspired, and often incorporate natural elements. They incorporate the RNA similar to what a coronavirus would have that encodes for its spike protein. And so RNA really isn't that bad of an idea since the virus has RNA to begin with. It's really quite an elegant idea.
All right. So we're not modifying really the way God has created us, but are we interfering with God's will in some way?
It depends on how you interpret God's will, I suppose. I know many Christian scientists like myself, many medical professionals would say that God has called us to our professions and that our work is bringing glory to God as we investigate his creation, as we investigate people ourselves, and as we try to care for one another and care for the environment that we've been given. I think that science really helps us to do that well, really helps us to carry out God's plan. And that's my view. I understand that some people would really disagree with that, but I think that view is shared by many Christian scientists and medical professionals.
Okay, that's great. All right, I'd like to open this for discussion. By the way, in full disclosure, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, I'm a strong vaccine advocate, and I've had both my Pfizer shots. So that's where I'm at. But I do understand there's a lot to discuss. Now, for procedures in terms of discussion here, this time I'd like to try a process where if you would like to make a comment or ask, could you please click on that reactions icon that you have at the bottom of the screen, and there should be a raise hand version there. If you click on the raise hand, then I can see that you'd like to say something, because the chat boxes have been, I can't keep up with them. so use that for comments, but if you want to say something, please put it on the raise hand. But we'll start with those who sent questions in advance. And Jerry Albert, I saw you over here. You submitted a question in advance. Would you like to unmute yourself? And in general, everybody stay muted unless you're asking the question. And be sure to unmute before you ask your question.
Okay.
So Jerry.
Yes. In your article, Rebecca, in the PSCF, you say we should approach vaccine hesitancy in other people by expressing empathy. How would you express empathy in words to someone who's very conservative and has vaccine hesitancy because she believes that vaccines have serious neurologic side effects? That's what Randy just talked about. Or especially vaccine manufacturing involves aborted stem cells.
Thanks, Jerry, for your question. And I appreciate you searching for some practical ways, because really, I think a lot of us are keen to do our part and to try to address vaccine hesitancy. And so what are some practical ways that you can show empathy That's essentially what I'm seeing from your question, what I'm hearing from your question. I think the first way to show empathy is to understand that vaccine hesitancy is a continuum, and not everyone is a diehard anti-vaxxer that is pro-disease and pro-sickness. Perhaps there are some people like that, but from what I see, there are a lot of people that are just generally concerned or confused or just have questions. And so I think understanding that not everyone that is asking questions is really against vaccines is a good place to start. And I think just making sure that you see the individual like a brother or a sister in Christ, someone who God loves and that we need to love too, and trying to see exactly why perhaps they are vaccine hesitant. I know some people have actually experienced adverse events or seen adverse events in people that they love. And so if you can figure out exactly where their vaccine hesitancy originates, I think that that's a helpful place to start. And so if it happened in someone they loved, or if it happened in themselves, then you can address that. I mean, I suppose to say it casually, that's just bad luck, but you can address that it does happen in some people and that you're sorry that that happened to them or happened to someone that they love. And I think a lot of people that are vaccine hesitant are just worried that vaccines do more harm than good. And so if you can talk about that topic, not necessarily throw out information at them, but say, okay, we all want the best for each other. We all want the best health for ourselves. We want the best health for our children. What are some of the decisions we can make to keep us all healthy? And I think trying to find some of that common ground, as myself and as Aaron Smith and as many others have pointed out, is just a good way to form a relationship. And it's a good way to get on some same pages, so to speak, so that the person you're speaking with isn't defensive right off the hop. And so I think really caring about the person, caring about where their vaccine hesitancy comes from, trying to find some common ground. Really, we all want the best for each other, for your patients, if you're a nurse or if you're a doctor, or for your children, if you're a parent. And then I think tailoring your approach from there. Okay. So that'll look a little bit different in different people, but that's where I'd start.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, thanks, Jerry. Go next to George. I think I saw you. George Pelagian. Are you, let's see, I think I see you here somewhere. You submitted a question in advance. George, can you unmute yourself there? Did you drop off? I saw you here earlier. Let me see. Yeah, looks like you've not there. Okay. George Seblid, are you there? Yeah, I see you over there. You submitted a few questions, but could you pick one of those and share those with us? Go ahead and unmute yourself. I see you. Yeah, no, you unmute yourself, please. Yeah, there it is. Hi.
Hi, I'm Sabla. I read your article because I was really interested. It says Christian reasons had response. When I read your article, I had a lot of questions because I'm coming from the theological aspect of view, not only from scientific view. Because I saw your article was not really integrated from the theological aspect of view. Since you are responding from the Christian view, I just wanted a lot of reasoning, argument that can address the Christian society. Because you used like maybe less than 1% scriptural reference. So I had a lot of questions because of that. But I have only one chance to ask you. So my question is, you presented vaccine as a greatest gift for humanity. Because coming from my Christian worldview, Christ is the greatest gift for humanity. Now I'm asking you as a scientist and as a Christian researcher, because most of the people who are in the church are not really a Christian researcher. They just go to church to listen to the word of God. But coming from the Christian worldview and as a scientist, how do you reconcile these two views? Vaccine as a greatest gift for humanity and Christ as a greatest gift for humanity, because I have not come across any Christian literature that says that presents different thing as a greatest gift for humanity except Christ. Then we try to integrate these two views and see, because I'm coming from my Christian worldview. Now my question is for you, because my Christian worldview tells me Christ as greatest gift. And now from your perspective, or from only from scientific view, you are presenting a vaccine as a greatest gift. How are you going to reconcile? Because your response and reasoning is a Christian worldview, a Christian faith, from a Christian faith. How are you going to reason and reconcile these two views and help the Christian community saying, no, guys, vaccine is the greatest gift. Christ cannot answer this. And I did not see any background study who Christ is. You did not define, you did not put it in your research kit. Now, can you reconcile this? Who's Christ for you?
That's a big question here. Yeah. Take a try at it, Rebecca.
Thank you. And your name is Sibley? Am I saying that well? Okay.
Yep.
Nice to see you and meet you a little bit, Sibley. I think I'll address some of your first observations. And you are correct. I cite a lot more science than I do scripture in my article. And I would say that is because of my background. I have far more expertise in science than I do in biblical or theological studies. And so that is certainly the purpose I set out to do. And so I hope I didn't disappoint my readers too much in diving into more science than theology. I wouldn't dare dive into more theology than I should because it's not my expertise. And I will leave that with the theologians. I think the part in the article that you're talking about is maybe the second paragraph. I'll just read out what I wrote here. So I wrote, vaccination is considered one of the greatest life-saving medical achievements of all time. And so I think what I'm trying to get at in this sentence is that in terms of our medical advances, vaccines have saved more lives than anything else any other medical advancement that we've achieved. And I don't think I would ever say that vaccines are the greatest gift to humanity, because I agree with what you're saying. Christ and his love and his sacrifice, the fact that he's took on our sin and died because of it, is by far an overall greater achievement than anything we earthly people could achieve. But I think if we just look at medicine and just focus on that field, I think vaccines really stand out. And so I hope that there's no confusion. I'm certainly not trying to say that vaccines in any way trump or supersede what Jesus has done for us.
Can you put research into your? Can you put Jesus into your research kit? Can we define Jesus from scientific aspect of view? Because when the medical field is headed toward different type of treatment, we are not going to stop here. Can we define Jesus from scientific point of view?
Well, I think through research and study, we can be confident that Jesus lived and that Jesus was a real person. But I think it's through scripture where we really understand who Jesus was. So science can assess the physical world quite well, but of course it cannot venture at all into the spiritual world. And so I don't know if that satisfies your question and if that addresses the question you were asking, but those are my thoughts on your question.
Well, it's a deep topic, so we could spend a lot of time on that, and we'll probably have to pursue that from different angles a little bit. But let's give some other people a chance. We've got several raised hands here. One is, I don't know how you pronounce your name, Osawayam. Are you there? If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, my name is Osawayam. Thank you, Rebecca, for the beautiful presentation. I just want to ask about one of the possible reasons for vaccine hesitancy. Though you didn't put it in your article, but I know during this COVID-19, during the pandemic, it came up, especially in the Christian circle, and it has to do with the vaccine containing a programmable chip, something that could be used to control people's minds and all of that stuff somehow tied to the mark of the beast and that kind of thing. I'm sure you're familiar with that that was making the rounds at some point. So how would you respond to people who have that concern?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Also, I am, and I really appreciate it. And you're right, that claim has made its rounds in the media. I still see it all over the place in social media, especially. And on a separate side note, I actually feel really bad for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They seem like such caring people, and yet so many have accused them of wanting to be quite controlling of others. And I'm not sure where that comes from, to be honest. And I'm not actually sure the best way to debunk that conspiracy theory, because in truth, that is what it is. We are not trying to program or control or track or follow people that receive vaccines. I suppose we put some of their health information into databases so that we can make sure that they do well with their vaccines and that we keep good records of that. But I honestly don't know the best way to debunk that conspiracy theory. I suppose at the end of the day, you have to trust that pharmaceutical companies are putting in the vaccine what they say they are. And we know that they are not putting in microchips into their vaccines.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, you. And another raised hand here, Valerio. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Thanks for the paper, Rebecca. I quite enjoyed reading it. Couple of questions here. I'm referring to specifically what you said regarding the aborted stem cells. And there was a comment in the paper here that vaccines protect the individual and prevent them from transmitting the infection to others. My question is there any evidence, any scientific evidence that once you're vaccinated, that you will not transmit the virus to anybody else?
That's a great question. And so in terms of this current pandemic, those studies are still being done to ensure that the current COVID-19 vaccines are not only protecting the individual, but are also reducing transmission. But we have some very strong evidence historically of other vaccines, not only protecting individuals, but also preventing transmission. And a lot of that data is epidemiological. When we look at the introduction of polio vaccines or the introduction of measles vaccines, we see stark declines in those infectious diseases, far greater than the number of individuals that perhaps are vaccinated at those times. And so it's a far great effect that vaccines have. They protect the individual, and they also can protect the population if enough of us receive those vaccines. And we can protect those that are vulnerable and perhaps for medical reasons can't receive vaccines. Those medical reasons are very valid. And so if the majority of people receive a vaccine, then we can protect those that can't.
I guess my point is, or my question, or my underlying thought here is that if there's really no evidence, at least not yet, that you're preventing further transmission, then it becomes more a question of, am I myself willing to take the risk? Because there is evidence that if I'm vaccinated, I'll have a less severe outcome. I mean, that's pretty established, right? So then it's just really about me. So then I would weigh that against the fact that these are abortion-tainted vaccines. And I mean, I think one thing I don't like about the article is how it seems, at least on initial read, that it makes light of that. I mean, it mentions, 2 abortions 55 years ago, as if that's all that's really at stake here. In fact, those 2 abortions represent an entire industry that's dedicated to destroying preborn children, right? So, it's not something to just be dismissed, right? So if you believe that you are really living for something greater than yourself, and you say, you know what, no, I'm not going to take that vaccine because, okay, I'll take the risk on myself, then I think that's a really good moral thing. And in fact, that's different than the question of, okay, well, I'll take the vaccine because I'm going to help protect others, right? And even if it comes to that, another thing with your article is you cite the Vatican and some documents. Well, if you actually look at one of the documents, and I have it actually right in front of me, there's a note from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith earlier in the year, and they said in there specifically, there's no moral obligation to take the vaccine. However, if you choose not to, then you have an obligation to do whatever you can to prevent the spread, right? So, like, don't say I'm not going to take it. I'm going to be, going out there and risking people. But if I decide I don't want to take it and I'm going to stay in my basement for the next year, that's okay, right? So I think my overall comment is that there seems to be a lot of moral pressure on people when, if you think about it, and if you look at what the church has actually said and what the science actually says, I don't think that pressure is justified. And I don't think we should make light of the fact that abortion is instrumental in this whole thing. So anyway, that's kind of...
No, Valeria, thank you so much for your comments. And I do acknowledge that I think Jerry perhaps asked or mentioned some of the abortion issue in his comment, and I didn't address it at that point. So I'll try my best to address your comments and perhaps those of others on the same issue. And I'm sorry if it feels like the article is not doing the abortion discussion justice. I did try to mention at the end of that section that this is by far the most significant issue in my view. And it is very justified. As Christians, we feel quite strongly about the importance of life, and especially the importance of the life of young individuals who cannot speak for themselves, obviously. And if I appear a little bit choked up, I am. Sorry. No, as a parent, this issue is close to my heart. But as a scientist, when I see, I'm going to be very honest at this point. If someone makes that choice to go through with an abortion to end the life of their unborn child, and if science way back when, not science modern day, but I suppose it did happen as recent as the 80s with the Percy-6 cell line. But in any case, if scientists then choose to make use of that life, to actually give that, in my view, give that life purpose so that we can understand fetal development, so that we can understand human biology better, and so that we can advance some of our medical studies, then to be honest, I see that as being a lot better than just letting that life end at that moment. I don't want to condone abortion at all, but I just want to say that I can see the scientific point of view. And I see how valuable it is when humans donate tissue for research, whether it's younger tissue or older tissue. It really helps us to understand human biology better. And I do acknowledge that this is a huge issue for Christians. And thankfully, there are vaccines that are not made with any cell lines derived from fetal tissues, but some are. The rubella portion of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and others, and the AstraZeneca and latest, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, do involve fetal cell lines in their manufacturing. The vaccines don't. The cells are not included in the vaccines themselves. But some may say that their manufacturing was tainted through this perhaps link with abortion. And so I don't want to talk about that lightly. That is a very significant issue, very significant discussion to be had. And I don't know if you want to follow up on anything I just said, or if anyone else would like to follow up.
Just a couple things. I mean, I totally see that. I mean, I'm very scientific in my thinking as well, but I mean, I can't help but say that there's a world of difference between donated tissue and fetal tissue. I mean, one is voluntary, one is not. And if you just sort of say, well, there was an evil was done, and let's acknowledge and go with the fruits of it, then I can't help but think you're somehow complicit in that, and you won't stop it. I mean, it's no different than like countries that are taking harvesting organs, right? Okay, so
I would say that's very different.
but I'm just saying it is.
But
that's my point. It's an entire spectrum, right? So, but there you could also make the argument. Well, we got the organ. There's a benefit. Well, like you're not doing anything to stop it. So, very complicated. I appreciate your comment. I think it was a very fair comment, but I think it's a very deep issue. And my point simply is that all the moral pressure, people being pressured and being suggesting that they're not somehow being moral by not going and taking the vaccine, I just don't think that's justified in light of all these considerations, right? So anyway, that's kind of my point. So
well, thank you for weighing in. Kerry Gray had his hand up next.
Hi, thank you for your paper and your summary here. I've given sort of a couple similar presentations in more local environments, and one reflection I have on this is the phrase "persuasion is better than coercion" with respect to this, and I just wondered. I don't remember seeing it in the paper, but what about the threats of coercive vaccinations and the idea of vaccine passports, and you have to show your vaccine card before you go to certain events or certain places. I've actually heard people say, well, when you start doing that, you're going to make people think twice about not getting it because they want to do these things that the vaccine card requires. And so, just that whole dynamic of one thing that I do think when you say persuasion is better than coercion, which your nod suggested you agree with that, but that itself is a trust creating approach, right? When you say, well, I don't care what you think. We're going to make sure you get a vaccine anyway, or you're not going to be allowed to live a normal life from now on. So anyway, could you just comment on that, reflect on that idea of coercion in vaccines, especially the COVID situation?
Yeah, that's an excellent topic, Terry. Thank you for bringing that up. I haven't given much thought to the coercion persuasion idea that you mentioned, but at first thought, I would agree with it. If we can persuade people that vaccination is in their best interest, is in our population's best interest, then that may be a more trusting approach than coercing them or forcing them or mandating vaccines. I have read a little bit of articles, a few, about some of the green passes or vaccine passports or other approaches that I believe Israel and Europe and even New York are looking into some of those. I think Israel is the only one that has implemented it so far, and I think Europe and New York are getting there, maybe later this summer or later this year. And from a public health standpoint, I understand the rationale. If we can put more protected people together, then we can reopen more businesses, and we can protect people's jobs and limit job loss and restart the economy and get people watching the sports they love and the operas and the arts and the music that they love, and people can travel again. And I see the many benefits, but I also acknowledge some of the ethical challenges with these procedures. A lot of these programs are based on a smartphone or based on access to a computer where they could then print off their pass and bring it with them. And so whenever you base a public health policy on those sorts of technologies, you are leaving people out because not everyone has access to those technologies. And so it does perhaps exacerbate some already existing iniquities in our healthcare system. So I acknowledge that there's a debate there, and I don't know if I can add anything all that constructive to that, but it's an interesting topic, and I see both sides really. And hopefully we can persuade enough people that maybe we won't necessarily need to coerce anymore.
Well, why is requiring adults to get COVID-19 vaccinations different from requiring children starting out public school needing their immunizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think the main difference, of course, would be that these COVID-19 vaccines are still under emergency use authorizations. And so it would be interesting to mandate those in comparison to the vaccines we have for children, which have been around for much longer. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense going into schools. And I really appreciate that the US has a lot of those policies in place because Canada does not. The province where I reside now, Manitoba, used to require children attending public schools to have proof of measles vaccination, but they changed that. And so very few provinces in Canada require vaccinations for children attending public school. But there are some similarities, but there are some differences between those two, I would say.
All right, let's go on to Brent Nelson. You're next. Brent, if you could unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
You sure can. Go ahead, Brent.
So there's been a little bit of chat with Terry and some others there in the chat about relative risk, right? And I'm just curious, Rebecca, if you think that's a good argument that, there is a risk to the vaccine, but it's very small, but relative to the virus, it's a small risk, right? And so I think in some circles that might go, but I don't know. Just if you'd like to comment on the relative risk factor.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. That's a great comment. And as a lab safety officer, I do risk assessments all the time, and so so this is terminology I know really well. And so, and this kind of goes back to, I believe, perhaps Valerio's previous comment that maybe it's okay for someone, if they're going to stay in their basement for the rest of the year, to not get the vaccine because they're at no risk, perhaps, of contracting the infection or passing it on to someone else. And so to an extent, I understand how people will perform those risk assessments and perhaps think that they are not at enough risk to get the vaccine. And indeed, vaccines have minor risks, but as you acknowledged, those infectious diseases that they prevent have far greater risks, far, far, far greater risks. And it's not just a risk to yourself, it's a risk to the population because these are infectious, contagious, transmissible diseases. And I know for myself, I would feel very guilty if I contracted one of these diseases and passed it on to someone else. And so for myself, when I do that risk assessment, I see vaccines as a clear, easy choice, the safest way out of this pandemic by far. And the scientific community agrees with that. But I understand that many people in the public that maybe don't do those types of risk assessments, or maybe for whatever reason see themselves or see the risk as just being very low, then it can be very difficult to try to convince them otherwise. And I think that's why not one of the reasons why vaccine hesitancy arose. Well, maybe I could say it like that. Perhaps one of the reasons why vaccine hesitancy has become so prevalent is because there is generally less risk out there. Vaccines have become a victim of their own success. We've eradicated a handful of diseases, smallpox in humans and rinderpest in cattle. We've almost eradicated polio. We did eradicate polio from North America measles from North America for a short period of time until it came back because not everyone was getting their vaccines. And so if we don't have those infectious diseases on our shore, it can be really easy to say, no, I don't need a vaccine. There's no risk of me getting tetanus, and there's no risk of me getting of my child getting whooping cough or measles or rubella or any of those other things. But we've had several outbreaks in recent years, and hopefully that wakes people up to the very real risk that these diseases can become a full-blown pandemic before we know it, like we're experiencing right now.
If I could summarize what you said, I think you just said that we're really bad as a collectively, if you're not trained in doing risk assessment, we're bad at it. Is that what you said?
If you're not trained in anything, you are susceptible to bias. Yes. If
Right.
you don't know...
You think, oh, there's a risk to the vaccine, but I haven't got COVID yet, so why should I take the risk? Because I'm good, right? So it's difficult for us, and we accept risk in our everyday life, where we don't hold the handrail when we go down the stairs or whatever, right? That there's all sorts of inherent risks that we accept because we're used to them. Interesting.
Thanks for summarizing, Brett.
Yeah. That's great, but let's not conclude here that someone who is trained in something isn't biased. Anyway, Annika, how you doing? Yeah, unmute. Yeah. Okay. That's Cy. You're.
Yeah, okay. My computer failed.
Okay. So I saw you still logged on over there. How you doing?
Yeah. Okay. But I couldn't get to the hand raise. Right. Thanks. I wanted to ask you about, I'm not sure that you covered this in your article. If you did, I missed it. And that is the history of the anti-vaccination movement. It's very interesting. But first, I just want to mention that, you did say that these vaccines, you talked about them as a form of medicine. But what's very interesting about what's going on is that nobody treats vaccines as they would other medicines in any respect. For example, side effects. There are far worse side effects in any of the medications that you can find in a normal medication shelf than there are with vaccines. The use of human cell lines like HEK, which is used in vaccine research, are used in the production of hundreds of medications. In fact, all of the human cell lines that exist come originally from aborted fetuses. There are some exceptions now, but the original ones that are in major use come from that. So you'd have to eliminate a lot of medications that people take routinely if you want to avoid that problem and if you want to avoid any possibility of side effects. So the question then is, why is the idea of a vaccine, so difficult for people to accept compared to, for example, a new medicine that comes out for it, you want to say? And the answer is the history, which is very interesting. Are you aware of the origin of the anti-vax movement? Have you covered that at all?
Aside from, I think, the one paragraph in the, page 2, I think, I briefly talk about some history in my article, but very little. So feel free to share any additional history that you know.
It goes much further back than Wakefield. It goes all the way back to the 19th century. And the original people who were against vaccinations were not Christians. They did not use theological arguments. They were not right wing. One of them was a progressive reformer in London. And their view was a sort of a spiritualistic idea that you're putting something into your body that does things that we don't understand, because they didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there were very few medications that were used in medicine. There weren't even sulfa drugs yet. So the idea of vaccination was disturbing to people for lots of reasons that now we wouldn't even consider coherent. And the problem is that movement has never died. And the anti-vax movement, which has been very strong, as you mentioned about measles, and you cover that, got a huge boost as soon as COVID-19 became a real problem. And everyone knew that a vaccine would come along eventually. They didn't know when it would happen. And the anti-vax movement got into high gear to attack the vaccine before there was even the first publication of the possibility of a vaccine being produced. They were strong among the deniers of the seriousness of the disease because they knew that a vaccine would end this pandemic, and they were against that. I'm not saying anyone here is part of this movement. It's a very small group of very dedicated fanatics, but their influence has been extremely strong. And unfortunately, they have now had a strong influence in the Christian community. So many of these issues, which are nothing in reality in vaccines compared to what they would be for medications, have now come from this very militant, strong anti-vax movement. And I really salute you for what you're doing, because it's absolutely critical I've been doing this myself online, talk to Christians. I get the same questions you've gotten, everything from the mark of the beast to the use of aborted cell lines. All of these questions are coming up all the time. And it's critical that scientists of Christian faith address these and relieve these fears and misimpressions. And whenever possible, it's not a bad idea to look into the real long-term history and see where this all comes from.
That's right. That's good. This may be a good point to insert a little bit of a advertisement for. Is it tomorrow night that Francis Collins is going to be speaking again on the Biologos channel? And I think he's going to be getting us the latest on vaccinations and the impact on variants. We haven't talked about that too much over here. It's not directly there, but I believe that's the case. I'm not sure how to tell you where to find it. If we can get a link on the chat line for everyone, but I think there's a whole set here with variants and this whole race between the speed of which we can get vaccinations up to the level that we need versus the rate at which the variants are mutating is a really serious issue, right?
No, definitely. I mean, I saw a headline the other day that said we're in a race, or variants versus vaccines, who will win, if it's a headline of that nature. And these viruses, while not alive, change rapidly and mutate the more hosts they find. And so if we can squash those infections, we will limit the number of new variants, limit the spread of existing variants, and hopefully get this pandemic under control.
Right. So if I may ask now, so what's the best strategy? So what I hear Cy saying and you saying, it's an intellectual exercise. We go around preaching the truth and expect all the vaccine hesitant people to be converted? Or how do we go about this if we really want to expand the number of people who are vaccinated? And I think the numbers are that if all those in the polling areas who express concern, if they don't get vaccinated, we may not be at herd immunity.
Yeah, how best do we fight this? Or maybe fight is a poor verb choice there, but how best do we respond? And I think it goes back a bit to maybe Jerry's question that started this off. Like, what do we say to people? And I think, as Cy mentioned, the fact that we are talking about this, people that care about this issue and that people who are educated about this issue, as long as we keep talking, as long as we don't tire of doing that good, then I think we are responding in the right way, or at least we're on the right track. In terms of what exactly to say, how best do we have these conversations, I just keep going back to that word empathy. And I try to display it here in discussions like this. I display it as a professor in my classroom when the evolutionary biology that I teach really contradicts with a student's faith. I think as long as we approach those topics with empathy, seeing people as people and trying to understand where their view comes from and perhaps where it originates. And if it originates in misinformation, then perhaps gentle conversations can lead them to some better sources of information. And I think understanding how social these decisions are is really important. And Erin Smith in her article highlights that really well. And we know that vaccine hesitancy occurs in clusters. And so we know that families believe this, churches believe this, communities believe this. It's not just isolated people here and there. It is social circles. And so if we can understand a little bit of the social pressure to adopt that anti-vax or vaccine hesitant view, then maybe we can start to replace it with one that's a little bit more trusting of science, trusting of medicine, trusting of vaccines in general.
Right. Okay. Any other questions here? We're a little past the hour already, but I don't want to cut off discussion. We can go on a little bit farther. If anyone else want to make a comment?
Rebecca, have you looked at particular religious groups that are more strongly opposed to vaccine, and what's the basis of their religious objection? I've already talked about aborted cell lines as one, but years before that was an issue, I used to worship with Mennonite folk in a very rural part of Iowa who would write notes to get their children into the public schools without immunizations because they objected to them. And so, again, I'm wondering which particular groups object most strongly on religious grounds, and what's the basis of their objection?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joseph. Thank you for that. And so I will admit that there are actually not a lot of studies on this. There are not a lot of systematic studies that actually look at different denominations, look at different churches, different traditions to see exactly the level of vaccine hesitancy present and their reasons for it. There is just, I've found in my research much more anecdotal evidence. And so it's cases here, it's groups here, but it's really hard to then compare one tradition to another or one faith background to another. As you mentioned, abortion is an issue, is a topic that arises frequently. In the Mennonites that I interact with here in southern Manitoba, it actually tends to be the kind of God's will argument, or that vaccines interfere with divine providence argument. I am shocked at the number of Mennonites in Manitoba that say, it's okay if I get the infection. God will save me. I'd rather be infected than be vaccinated. And to me, that's just a very scary and selfish way to think, honestly. That's my view. As I've said previously, this is not a disease that just infects an individual, but it's a disease that an individual can transmit to someone else. And so we need to remind ourselves that we are called first and foremost to love God and then to love our neighbor. And so hopefully we as Christians can try to apply that to vaccinations and to the measures we are taking in this pandemic more generally, mask wearing and social distancing and whatnot. But overall, I guess I don't have a great answer to your question about some of the specific reasons. I'm not aware of those.
Okay. Let's see. Anyone else? Ken Turian, you had a question in the chat line. Did you want to ask anything, or are you okay? Oh, did you pop off?
Randy?
Yes.
Yeah, John Wood here.
Okay. Oh, there you are. Okay. Sure,
right.
John.
Yeah. Rebecca, thank you. This has been very helpful. I especially on the the question about using fetal stem cells and those lines and that development. So I put something in on that. I would direct people to another ASA member, James Shirley. If you go look up James on the line, I'm sorry, I did this for my pastor and I just can't find the folder on my desktop. But James has a a number of very interesting, helpful resources with an institute whose name escapes me right now, but very helpful little tutorial pieces that give some of the background and history. And I just found them very, very helpful resources. I find my pastor and pastors in the past over the years really look to us to help them navigate these complex conversations. So this has been really helpful today. The other piece of this, I'm reminded that blood transfusions in Jehovah's Witness, for instance, is another. This is one that I knew about in the 50s as I was growing up as a kid. You know, you start hearing these things and wondering. I think some of what and so I was appreciative of your pointing to Aaron Smith, because I think the social scientists can help us navigate how these decisions are made. It'd be much more nuanced conversation in the church. There are just so many solitudes, so many different communities of conversation, and the internet today has allowed these to just explode. So, you know, those of us who were around for the elections in the early 1960s and watched the run-up and read, maybe heard about the John Birch Society and read A Nation of Sheep in paperback that was circulating around, saw a reprise of that in the recent US politics. There have been times in the past that we go through these cycles, and Randy, we had the discussion about Galileo and his time period, and the arguments and confusion, and so this is not new for us. We're not just coming to this brand new. And so we really have to appreciate the diversity of conversation and voices. So thanks for your comment here on empathy and really respecting each other. It's very, very helpful.
Well, thanks, John. That feedback means a lot. Thank you.
Randy, you have any time left?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
You know, one of the things, Rebecca, that is really going to be difficult to overcome, there is a general decoupling of the rank and file in the leadership in this country. And the rank and file across many ideological lines, Christian, atheist, Democrat, Republican, you name it, don't trust people in authority. They feel they've been played for a sucker too often. And I see it especially here in Wyoming, where we have a rural state that has all kinds of stuff crammed down our throat by urban areas and environmental areas. I mean, you know, grizzly bears are your friends. You should have one in your backyard, right? Live in San Francisco, maybe that's okay, but not Wyoming. And there's all this kind of resentment out there that I don't know how to overcome. So lots of luck. I hope you succeed.
Well, no, thanks, Chris. And that's such a good point. I think you're hitting on this mistrust that is so common, especially in areas that may feel more isolated or may feel more disconnected from some of those urban, scientific, medical areas. And the way that I've tried to combat that the best is introducing people to other scientists, introducing people to, dare I say it, pharmaceutical scientists, people in big pharma. They're actually nice, moral, good people. And I think the more we kind of tear that veil, so to speak, and get scientists communicating, speaking, and out there in the public, then hopefully people can trust them more. Hopefully people can see that they're not actually trying to give a microchip in your arm, and they're not actually trying to hurt you. They're doing their job because they really care about us, about our planet. And I get a little bit emotional about this again, because I've had a lot of people say really mean things about scientists. Really mean things. And when you think about scientists as people, how dare you say some of those things? How dare some people say some of those things? Accuse you of being unethical, without morals. And it can be really hard as a scientist to hear some of that mistrust and to hear some of that misinformation and just blatant character shaming. And so I think the more and more we talk to scientists and medical professionals and vaccine researchers, the more we realize that they're people too. And they're just trying to do their best in a really challenging time.
Yep. And let's close with one more question that comes from David Wing, who doesn't have his microphone, so I'll pass it along here. Could you just make a comment on treatment versus vaccines to deal with COVID-19?
Yeah, so I believe right now we only have one approved treatment, remdesivir, if I am not mistaken. I don't know if any others have been approved in more recent days. And so we certainly have more vaccine options than treatments, because vaccines are really our safest way out of this. And so I understand the push for more vaccinations compared to treatments. I hope in the future we will assess more treatments. I know scientists are. We've only really just come up with the one positive case story of remdesivir. Anyways, that antiviral drug. And a monoclonal antibody treatment. As Terry Gray has said. Okay, I was unaware of that one.
Okay. I said that was the last question, but it made me think of one more. Do the techniques used by Pfizer, Moderna, and so on with the mRNA, does this presage a future of more effective and more rapid vaccination development in the future? Is this both more effective and safer?
I think so. And I think that this is where vaccination is going. Actually, one of my first work terms as an undergraduate student was with Immunovaccine Technologies in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And as a co-op student, I worked on lipid nanoparticles, which are used, versions of them are used in the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines. And funny story, I actually remember as a young co-op student being really excited to do some of the manual labor. We actually had to fill up a syringe with lipids and then put on a filter and then attach another syringe. And I just pushed the solution from one side to the other, to the other, to the other. 40 passes ensured your particles were of the size that the filter dictated. Anyways, I remember some of that manual labor quite well. So I'm very excited to see the success of lipid nanoparticles. It is incredibly difficult to break ground with new pharmaceutical agents like that, especially when existing vaccines or existing drugs are already on the market. It's tough to prove a new product is better than what we already have. But that is perhaps one of the good things about this pandemic, is that it's really promoted technological and scientific innovation, because we have nothing on the market right now. Scientists can really develop what they think is best and not actually try to beat out something that's already existing.
Right.
So anyways, it's interesting.
That's great. It's amazing that process you used, it was scaled up to volume manufacturing, isn't it?
Well, we've known for a long time that lipid nanoparticles are really fantastic, microscopic little vehicles. They can shuttle and move things around quite effectively. Our cells use extracellular vesicles all the time. So it really makes sense as a vaccination technology. And whenever people have asked me about kind of this novel type of vaccine, I get really excited. It's such an elegant, simple way to vaccinate individuals. And I really hope that we see more of these vaccines in the future.
That's great. And that's a wonderful note on which to end. And I know I speak for everyone in giving you very hearty appreciation and thank you for your article. Thank you for your participation. And again, we will be posting this and should be available soon. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, everyone.